All right, let's spend a couple of minutes reading here from Romans chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, the longing of my heart and my prayer to God is for the people of Israel to be saved. I know what enthusiasm they have for God, but it is misdirected zeal. For they don't understand God's way of making people right with himself. Refusing to accept God's way, they cling to their own way of getting right with God by trying to keep the law. For Christ has already accomplished the purpose for which the law was given. As a result, all who believe in him are made right with God. For Moses writes that the law's way of making a person right with God requires obedience to all of its commands. But faith's way of getting right with God says, don't say in your heart, who will go up to heaven to bring Christ down to earth? And don't say, who will go down to the place of the dead to bring Christ back to life again? In fact, it says, the message is very close at hand. It is on your lips and in your heart. And that message is the very message about faith that we preach. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God, and it is by confessing with your mouth that you are saved. As the scriptures tell us, anyone who trusts in him will never be disgraced. Jew and Gentile are the same in this respect. They have the same Lord, who gives generously to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." How can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of the messengers who bring good news. Not everyone welcomes the good news. For Isaiah the prophet said, Lord, who has believed our message? So faith comes from hearing, that is, hearing the good news about Christ. But I ask, the people of Israel actually heard the message? Yes, they have. The message has gone throughout the earth and the words to all the world. But I ask, did the people of Israel really understand? Yes, they did. For even in the time of Moses, God said, I will rouse your jealousy and people who are not even a nation. I will provoke your anger through the foolish Gentiles. And later Isaiah spoke boldly for God, saying, I was found by people who were not looking for me. I showed myself to those who were not asking for me. But regarding Israel, God said, all day long I opened my arms to them. They were disobedient and rebellious. Chapter 10 continues the train of thought that Paul had in chapter 9. And that is this conversation about what happens with his own people, the Israelites. How do they still fit in with this picture of what God is doing in the world? Do they fit in? Is a question that Paul is asking. So I want to begin by talking about Christ as the end or the fulfillment or the accomplishment of the law. We've kind of talked about this a little bit already, but Paul hits it harder in this chapter. You can see how Paul begins chapter 10 in much the same way that he did chapter 9. He reiterates once again his desire for his fellow Jewish believers to find salvation. And for Paul, in other words, that means that he wants them to come to a knowledge and a belief in the Messiah, Jesus. And Paul praises the zeal of the Jews here. Did you notice that? He says they're very, very zealous. But what does he say about it? That it's misdirected. Reminds me of Paul himself. Let's think before Paul was even a Christian. What word might we use to describe Paul? Very zealous, right? Very zealous in destroying Christianity, wasn't he? So much so that he would take dictates from the temple, go to other cities to arrest and imprison Christians that he might find there. I would call that zeal. But what did he find out in doing that? Very, misdirected at the same time. I think Paul sees himself in the Roman Jewish Christians that he's talking to here. Right? He's identifying with them in his own personal story. He knows what it's like to feel very zealous for God, but to have that zeal misdirected and pointed in the wrong direction. And so you can imagine Paul's heartache for his people as he personally identifies with them, not just because he's a Jew, but because he himself set out on a mission, as we see in Acts, to destroy the church. He doesn't just identify with them biologically, but also ideologically with who he was before. He once agreed with them about the dangers that Christianity posed to them as Jews, and that following Jesus might pose. Now he longs for those who were once like he was to come to faith in Jesus. The word for righteousness here is, we're talking about righteousness all throughout Romans. It actually gets used 4 times in the midst of just verses 3 and 4. It's interesting because you might go, well, when I read 3 and 4, I don't see the word righteous used 4 times in those 2 verses. And that's, again, because, as we've talked about at different times, words have nuance in meaning, right? There's never a perfect one-for-one, word-for-word translation. And so translators do the best job that they can to help it make sense. But Paul is clearly highlighting this idea of righteousness, or of being made right, or uprightness, or justice even. He's highlighting that idea here. And so what we have to understand again is that Paul, when he uses this word, it carries all of those meanings together with it. Right? It's not just righteousness as we think about it, but it is justice, it's covenant faithfulness, it's being made right with God. And so there are several things to keep in mind with these opening verses here in chapter 10. First thing that I think Paul is re-emphasizing here is that God has been faithful to his covenant. The Messiah, Jesus, really was God's plan all along from the foundation of the world. That Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of what God's plan was to save not just humanity, but to save creation itself. That membership into this covenant that God has made is marked out now by faith in the Messiah, and not by keeping the law. So the Gentiles who believe in Jesus have no need to keep the law any longer, and therefore they are full members in this family. The Jews attempted to use the law in a way that it was never intended, and that is as a badge of covenant membership. And so, as Paul says at the end of chapter 9, they tripped over the stone. They didn't understand clearly what it was that God was doing in and through them. So Gentiles who believe in the Messiah, again, are full members in this family. And the Jews failed to recognize that Jesus, the Messiah, was the goal, the fulfillment of the law. And it's been a struggle throughout the ages for Christians to figure out what does Paul mean by Jesus being the fulfillment or the end of the law. Does that mean that the law now, that it's gone away? Is that what he means by end? Or does he mean fulfillment as in the law was pointing to Jesus all along? I like the way that an ancient Christian writer, John Chrysostom, he wrote and lived at the end of the 4th century. He talked about it this way, that like medicine is to health, the law is to Christ. You take medicine to get healthy, right? You go to somebody who knows how to heal your body to help you get well. That points you to the end goal. But it itself isn't what you're aiming for, right? You're not aiming to take more medicine. You're aiming to get well. He talks about Jesus and the law in the same way. The law isn't health. Jesus is health. The law is something you take to get to be healthy. I like that analogy that he uses about Jesus and the law. The law was never meant to do what Jesus came to do. And I think a lot of people misunderstand that. We have to take Paul at his word. I I think. Paul is making it very clear that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for the world. And so I think this is what Paul is so frustrated with, that his own people, they can't see past the law that God gave them. So he's going to talk about that here. So we're going to talk about the fulfillment of the covenant. Because if we're going to understand what Paul is saying in this chapter, then we're going to have to understand his interaction with his own scriptures, with the Old Testament as we call it. In particular, we have to get a grasp of what he's talking about from Deuteronomy. So, without making this into a sermon about Deuteronomy chapter 30, quickly, I want to tell you what's happening in Deuteronomy 30, but to do that, you actually have to understand what's happening in Deuteronomy 28 and 29. Now, everything just kind of backs up on itself, right? But it really is important. So in 28 and 29 of Deuteronomy, God, through Moses, gives a long list of curses. It's actually one of the places that a lot of Christians get to. If they can get through Leviticus, which, you ever started a yearly reading plan and you get to Leviticus and you stop there, and you realize a year later, I stopped in Leviticus, If anybody gets through Leviticus and they get to Deuteronomy, often this is where they stop. In Deuteronomy 28 and 29, because people don't like to read the curses that God lays before the Israelites, saying that if you don't keep the covenant, here are the things that are going to happen to you, right? He's laying out up front, here's what can happen if you fail to follow me. The culmination of those curses is that they will be exiled from their land. They will be removed, taken away from this promise that God has given them. They're going to be sent into exile. That's how 28 and 29 culminate. And then Deuteronomy 30 arrives. It arrives with a new promise. And it would be very natural for the Israelites, I think, to assume that going off into exile would kind of be the end for them. Right? God is not going to do twice what he already did by bringing us out of Egypt in the Exodus. Right? God is not going to do that twice. They couldn't be further from the truth if they thought that way. Scattered, unable to worship as they always had, rudderless without God. They might imagine that all hope is gone for them. And in fact, we see that as they're in Babylon. A people who feel very much that way. But what does God promise? That if they turn back to him, if they once again cry out to him, that he will rescue and redeem them, that a remnant will come home. The promise goes even further in that God promises a change of heart for them. There won't be any need for anybody once again to climb up a mountain to hear from the Lord. They won't have to spend years combing the land to find this God who deserted them. The message, as we see here in Paul, the message will come to them. So Paul is taking what Moses talked about as the message being the law coming down to the Israelites, literally from the hand of God, right? As Paul's up on Mount Sinai, he receives the law from the hand of God himself. What does Paul believe to be the message that has come among God's people? Jesus. Right? The true fulfillment of this message all along. You see, many Jews of Paul's day were trying to figure out what that message would be. We have Jewish sources from outside the Bible at the same time, around the same time that Paul wrote, and they talk about this very topic. They talk about Deuteronomy 30. What was the message that God promised to deliver? Some thought he's going to deliver a new and better law for us. The same kind of thing, but it's going to be new. Better, maybe more simplified, easier to follow, perhaps something like that. Others thought that there was going to be some special wisdom from God, that he was going to divinely inspire a few people, that they would receive this amazing wisdom, and that would be the new message that God was promising. Well, both of those are partly true. God did give us a new law, a law of the Spirit, as Paul calls it back in Romans 8, right? God does give us a certain kind of wisdom. Paul in 1 Corinthians talks about Jesus as the wisdom, the very wisdom of God. So, in a sense, they were right. But again, as we talked about last week, going on that journey with his fellow Israelites, Paul has been reading the signs all along, and what does he do? He takes the road that he's supposed to be following, and he sees his people heading down the opposite way, fork in the road. The Messiah is the message. The Messiah is the good news. And we've been talking about that since Romans 1. That I think the way Paul defines gospel, the way Paul defines good news, is Jesus himself. And so for Paul, what is true of the law is true of the Messiah, since the law points the way to the Messiah. The gospel is not inaccessible to the Jews. Paul is trying to make that clear to them. The gospel is right in front of you. It's not beyond their reach. If the law is near, as Deuteronomy says, then Jesus, the Messiah, is all that much nearer to them, because the saving Word of God is more accessible than ever. The saving Word of God is more accessible than ever. It's found in a person. So Paul was hopeful for his fellow Jews. He sees the way for them, and he explains what it entails in chapter 10. If they confess that Jesus is Lord, and they believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, then they will be considered righteous, and once again, part of God's covenant family. A quick side note about confessing and believing here. A lot have taken Romans 10 and then assumed that baptism really isn't all that important, right? Because Paul doesn't mention it here. So, if baptism were actually important, wouldn't Paul bring it up right here whenever he says, confess and believe and you'll be saved, right? But of course, Paul's already discussed baptism in chapter 6. He's already made it quite clear how he feels about it. So perhaps we shouldn't be so quick to discard what he's already written. But additionally, we know from early Christian sources that the main time of confession, of confessing and professing with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, happened at baptism. So it wouldn't be shocking or surprising at all to suppose that when Paul writes this, that the Roman Christians know exactly what he's talking about. Confession means at my baptism. Right? That's when I confess that Jesus is Lord, much in the same way that we still practice it today. Right? We can confess at all days, at all times, that Jesus is Lord, but the primary time when we do that is when we go into the waters of baptism, right? I think that's what Paul is referencing here. So he doesn't need to say it again, because the people already know when he mentions it. That's precisely what he's talking about. That was a little side note. Just to clear up, again, like I said, people use this as a time to say, Paul doesn't talk about baptism enough, right? It's not that important to him. I think it is. All right. The final thing I want to talk about is this call to the world. This is something Paul's been emphasizing all throughout Romans, and he does it again. The message of the Messiah isn't just for the people of Israel, but it is intended for the whole world. And so chapter 10 closes in this grand fashion, I think. Romans is kept building and building as Paul continues to lay out the truth as he believes God has revealed it in history. The ultimate truth that Paul is a minister of, one that unfortunately I think flies in the faces of his fellow Israelites, is that the Gentiles are part of this covenant family now. The Gentiles are more than welcome in God's family, and Paul is actually, through quoting the Old Testament prophets, making that point quite clear. He's proving it very clearly that this was part of God's plan all along to include the Gentiles in this message and mission. And Paul actually quotes from 3 different portions of the Bible. He quotes from his scriptures, at least. He quotes from the law. He quotes from the prophets. And he quotes from the writings. So that doesn't mean a whole lot to us as Christians. But for a Jew, the fact that Paul is quoting from these 3 distinct portions of the Hebrew Scriptures, those were the 3 distinct portions of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so what Paul is saying by quoting from each of those is that this message is contained within the whole of our Scriptures. You've missed it, right? Again, he's trying to lay out these signposts for them to see. You've missed it. You've missed the message all along. We weren't seeing it clearly. Because of all this, Paul is communicating that those who weren't even looking for God's deliverance, the Gentiles, were never looking for God's deliverance in this way, right? And yet somehow they've stumbled upon it and received salvation. But the opposite is also true. Those who were eagerly anticipating it, right? For thousands of years, the Jews moment, for God to step into history and do something grand. What happened? They missed it altogether. So many of them have missed the point that God was trying to make from the beginning of time. So I think Paul is kind of saying the Gentiles were like people hanging out in the street, unaware that this huge wedding banquet is happening just down the street from them. It is being prepared. Food is about to be served. The plates are ready. The servants are ready to welcome people in. And now they've suddenly received urgent invitations to come to the feast. They're going to get to enjoy the banquet that they never even knew existed. And on the other hand, the Israelites are like those who were invited originally. Right? The invitations were sent out. They said, yes, we're going to come to the feast. We're part of your people. We're going to come to the feast. And then when the time comes, they make up every excuse under the sun not to show up. It sounds a little something like what Jesus once said. It might be a parable in it itself. It's funny how that happens, isn't it? That Paul ends up agreeing with Jesus. It's almost like it was on purpose. It's surprising, isn't it? The gospel, the good news, is for everybody. And I thank God that it is. Because if it weren't, I don't think I'd be standing in front of you right now. I don't know what I would be doing. I don't know where I would be. I don't think I would be here right now. The message of God goes out to all the world, for all people. Just a couple of things to conclude. You know, it's easy to relate to Paul in this chapter, I think, because we're Gentiles. The fact that this message welcomes us as well is good news to us. But we can also think about this message in this way as well. Are you happy to know that God's salvation is freely offered to all people, even those that you might classify as an enemy? Is that good news to you? There might be somebody in your life that you dislike, dare I say even border on hatred toward a person. The gospel message, the Messiah, is still good news even for that person. Is that good news to you as well? And if it's not, as I think Paul is dealing with some of the Jewish Christians in Rome, that it doesn't seem like good news to them that the Gentiles are suddenly part of this work of God. What does that say about us? We have that hang up in our lives. And what do we need to do to make that right? The second thing I want to leave you with: when was the last time your feet brought the good news to someone in your life? When was the last time your feet brought good news to somebody? And of course, I am doing what Paul does and saying good news means Jesus. So in other words, when was the last time you shared the good news of Jesus with somebody in your life? You have to think really long and hard about that. Maybe that should change. Right? Maybe, just maybe, you ought to be a little more free-flowing with this good news that we have. The banquet is open to all. God is calling all people to the feast. I don't know about you, but I don't want anybody left out. I don't want anybody left out. And it's not just because I like food. It's because I really want people there. That's what Paul is calling us to want as well. That's Romans chapter 10 in a nutshell. Obviously, there's a lot more there. And maybe I didn't cover something that you were going, yeah, I really wish you would have talked about this. Well, too bad. Too bad. Maybe we can come back to it another time. Romans chapter 10 is full of good news for all of us. Not just for us who sit in this room, for all people that we come in contact with. Good news is for everyone. I hope that is good news to us, so that we're ready to share it with others. We're going to have a time of invitation where you can come if you have need of encouragement or prayer, or anything going on in your life that you want to share with us. We want to comfort you. We want to take care of you if there's something we can do. So come forward as we stand and as we sing.